Something just shifted in the atmosphere, and it happened days before anyone thought it would. The computer models that guide every forecast in this country went to sleep one night showing a hot, stubborn, unmoving late summer, and they woke up showing something completely different. A pattern is now locking into place across the top of the world, a pattern so large it stretches from the coast of Alaska all the way to the frozen edge of Greenland, and it is going to reach down and grab the middle of the United States by the collar. If you have been sweating through night after night that never cools off, if you have been staring at your thermostat wondering when this endless heat finally breaks, then stay with me, because the answer is closer than you have been told, and it is arriving faster than almost anyone expected. Make sure you are subscribed to F for Forecast right now, because over the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what is coming, when it hits your part of the country, and the one twist buried inside this pattern that most people are going to completely miss. This is the forecast that changed overnight, and by the end of this, you will understand it better than the people who only read the headlines. Let me start with the part that matters most to you, and then I will show you the machinery behind it, because the how is just as fascinating as the what. Up near the very top of our hemisphere, high in the atmosphere where the jet stream races around the globe like a river of wind, something called a blocking pattern is forming. That word blocking is exactly what it sounds like. Normally, the jet stream flows fast and mostly straight from west to east, and it drags weather systems along with it, one after another, keeping everything moving. But every so often, a giant dome of high pressure plants itself in a spot and refuses to budge. It acts like a boulder dropped into that river of wind. The flow can no longer go straight through, so it has to bend. It buckles, it carves out enormous loops, and inside those loops, cold air that normally stays trapped up in the Arctic suddenly finds an open door to the south. Two of these boulders are setting up at once, and that is what makes this so unusual. Here's where it gets specific. Forecasters watch a handful of key measurements to know when this kind of thing is about to happen, and right now, several of them are flashing the same signal at the same time. The first is something called the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is really just a way of measuring the pressure set up over the northern Atlantic near Greenland. When that number swings negative, it means high pressure is building up over Greenland, and that is one of the two boulders I mentioned. The latest data has that number diving negative right around the 24th of the month and staying there, potentially all the way into the first days of September. That is not a small blip. That is a sustained shift, and it is the kind of setup that reroutes cold air toward the eastern half of the country. The second measurement is the East Pacific Oscillation, and this one governs what happens up near Alaska. When it goes negative, a ridge of high-pressure balloons up over Alaska and the northeastern Pacific. That is the second boulder. And here's the part that made forecasters look twice at their screens. Both of these signals are turning negative at nearly the same time, in the same window, and they reinforce each other. A negative reading near Alaska builds a block on the western side of the continent. A negative reading near Greenland builds a block on the eastern side. Put a wall of high pressure on both ends, and the cold air trapped in the middle of that buckled jet stream has nowhere to go but down, straight into the heart of North America. Now, I want to be honest with you the way I promised to be in every one of these forecasts, because there is a real disagreement happening between the models right now, and it matters. The two heavyweight forecast systems that meteorologists lean on most are the European model and the American model. Think of them as two extremely experienced navigators looking at the same storm on the horizon. Most of the time, they agree on the big picture, and right now they do agree that a block is coming and that cooler air is heading south. But they disagree on how strong that block gets and how far south the cold reaches. The American model is leaning toward a deeper, stronger block, which would send colder air plunging much farther down the map. The European model sees the same shift, but keeps it a little more restrained, cooler in the north, but not diving as dramatically toward the south. That gap between them is the single biggest uncertainty in this entire forecast. And I will come back to it, because how that argument resolves decides whether the Deep South gets any real relief at all. There's a third piece I have to add, because it is the engine sitting underneath everything. Out in the Pacific Ocean, El Niño is strengthening, and it is strengthening fast. The Climate Prediction Center now puts the odds at greater than 90% that this becomes a very strong event heading into the fall and winter. That is a big deal, and here is why it connects to what is happening over your head right now. El Niño warms a vast stretch of the tropical Pacific, and when that ocean warms, it changes where thunderstorms fire off near the equator, which in turn nudges the entire jet stream into a new configuration thousands of miles away. It is one of the clearest examples in all of science of how the ocean and the sky are wired together. The warming Pacific is helping tilt the deck toward exactly the kind of buckled, blocky jet stream pattern we are watching assemble. So this is not random noise. There is a driver behind it, and that driver is only getting stronger. So let me paint the picture of how this actually unfolds day by day, because the timing is everything. Right now, and for the rest of this week, you are already feeling the first hints of change. A cooler push of air is sliding through parts of the country, and it is real, but here is the catch that trips a lot of people up. This first cool shot is not the main event. It is a preview. Every single day, the heat gets reinforced right behind it, so you might wake up to a beautiful morning and then watch the temperature climb right back up by afternoon. Across the northern tier, you are looking at highs settling into the 70s, where you had been baking in the 90s, which is a genuine break. But it comes and goes. The pattern is not fully locked in yet. It is loading up, like a wave pulling back before it breaks. The real turn, the one this whole forecast is built around, arrives when we push toward the 25th and 26th. That is when the block matures. That is when high pressure fully anchors up toward Alaska and up toward Greenland, and the jet stream carves its deepest trough down into the middle of the country. When that happens, a substantial cold front comes barreling south, and this one is not a preview. This is the wave finally breaking. For the Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, and the Northeast, we are talking about temperatures running 10 to 15 degrees below average, and in the core of the coldest air, potentially 20 degrees below average. Let that number sit for a second. 20 degrees below normal in the final days of August is the kind of anomaly that makes people reach for a jacket they had packed away for the season. Overnight lows in the coldest pockets could tumble into the 50s. And if the American model's deeper solution wins out, some spots could even flirt with the 40s. That is a taste of early autumn arriving, while the calendar still says summer. Here is a question I genuinely want you to answer down in the comments, because it helps me tailor these forecasts to where you actually live. Tell me your city or your region, and tell me one thing. Are you the person cheering for this cold front to come crashing through, or are you the person who is not ready to let summer go? I read these, and the split is always fascinating, because this same pattern is a rescue for some of you and a disappointment for others. Drop it below and let me know which side you're on. Now here is the twist I promised you at the very beginning, the thing most people are going to miss. While all of that cool air floods into the north and east, the exact same pattern does something almost cruel to the southern part of the country. Remember, when you build a giant block and force the jet stream to buckle, you do not just create a cold trough. On the flip side of that buckle, you create a ridge, a dome of heat, and this pattern shoves that heat dome right over the west and the south central states. So at the very moment, folks in the upper Midwest are pulling out sweatshirts, folks across Texas, Oklahoma, the deep south, and the desert southwest are getting hammered by relentless, dangerous heat. This is not a small footnote. The Climate Prediction Center has issued a key message specifically warning about extreme heat and rapid onset drought building across the southern United States. That means the ground dries out fast, the heat feeds on itself, and it becomes a genuine hazard, not just an inconvenience. Picture the map for a moment as a seesaw. Press down hard on one end, and the other end shoots up. That is precisely what is happening across the continent. The same atmospheric setup that delivers blessed relief to the north is locking a lid of heat over the south. In the hottest zones across the desert southwest, we are still talking about afternoon highs, punching past 110, even 115 degrees. Across the south central and southeast, widespread readings over 100 are on the table, with heat index values, the number that tells you what it actually feels like on your skin once you factor in the humidity, climbing well beyond that. And the drought risk makes it worse because dry soil cannot cool itself the way moist ground does. Every hot day bakes the land a little harder, and that baked land then radiates even more heat back into the air the next day. It is a feedback loop, and once it gets going, it is hard to break. That divide, cool and refreshing up north, blistering and dangerous down south, is the real story of this pattern. It is a tale of two Americas separated by a single line on a weather map, and where you happen to live on that line decides everything about your next 2 weeks. The farther the block pushes that cold front south, the more the country escapes the heat. If the American model is right and the block goes deep, that front could theoretically push all the way toward the Gulf as we move into September, which would be a genuine shock to the system for places that have not felt below average air in what feels like forever. If the European model is right and the block stays more contained, then the relief mostly stops short, and the South stays locked under that dome longer. This is why I keep hammering on the difference between the models. It is not a technicality, it is the whole ballgame for tens of millions of people. Let me pull back from the big pattern for a moment and talk about the here and now, because a shifting pattern like this does not arrive quietly. When cold air on the move starts colliding with warm, humid air that has been sitting in place, the atmosphere reacts, and that reaction is storms. Over the past couple of days, that clash has already produced rounds of rough weather, and the Storm Prediction Center is flagging more of it as the front pushes through. The good news, and I want to be clear and calm about this rather than hype it up, is that this is not shaping up to be a major tornado situation. The primary threat with these storms is wind, along with hail, and I will explain exactly why that is, because understanding the why keeps you safer than just hearing the warning. For the middle of this week, forecasters have painted what is called a slight risk of severe storms across the Central Plains, the lower Missouri Valley, and the upper Midwest. In plain language, that means scattered strong storms are likely, and some of them will cross the line into severe. The setup involves steep lapse rates, which is a fancy way of saying the air cools off very quickly as you go up, and that kind of profile is like a ramp for rising air. It lets thunderstorms build tall and strong in a hurry. Layer in a boost of wind higher up in the atmosphere as an overnight low-level jet cranks up, and you get storms that can organize into clusters and produce damaging gusts as they race across the landscape. The Storm Prediction Center has been highlighting the potential for wind gusts strong enough to snap branches, knock down power lines, and cause the kind of scattered outages that leave neighborhoods dark for hours. There is also a real hail threat, with some storms capable of dropping stones large enough to dent cars and damage roofs, in some cases exceeding 2 inches across in the most intense cells. Geographically, watch the northern Rockies and the central high plains as a shortwave, which is just a small ripple of energy in the upper atmosphere, dives southeast and lights off storms. Watch the upper Midwest, across parts of Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where storms fire ahead of the advancing front and may start as isolated supercells capable of large hail before they collapse into a line and turn into a wind threat by evening. And keep an eye on the Central Plains and lower Missouri Valley, where storms are expected to cluster and grow upscale into an organized system with a real damaging wind potential as it sweeps toward Missouri. Down across Mississippi, Alabama, and into northern Florida, a very moist and unstable air mass supports storms too, though the wind shear there is weak, so those tend to be more of the pulse and collapse variety that still pack a punch with sudden downbursts. Looking one day further ahead, the severe threat shifts and organizes around parts of the Ozark Plateau into the Mid-South, with 1 or 2 clusters of storms capable of producing swaths of damaging wind. There is even a mention of central and southeastern Arizona getting into the act as monsoon moisture interacts with the terrain. The tornado risk on these days remains low, generally in the 2% range, which forecasters classify as a marginal isolated concern rather than a widespread danger. If a brief spin-up happens, it would most likely be quick and short-lived rather than the long-track monsters you see in the peak of spring. Then, heading toward Thursday, the action nudges into the northern plains from Minnesota into Nebraska and northern Kansas, with large hail as the headline threat thanks to that combination of strong shear, steep lapse rates, and just enough moisture. A separate, smaller threat for locally damaging gusts sets up from eastern Virginia into the Carolinas as a wave crosses the Appalachians. I want to give you something practical here, because forecasts are only useful if they change what you do. When storms like these are in the area, the single most important thing is to have a way to get warnings even when you are asleep. A weather radio or the alerts on your phone can wake you up when a warning is issued for your exact location. Damaging winds and large hail do not require a tornado to be dangerous. A 70-mile-per-hour gust can bring a tree down onto a house just as easily as it can knock out the power for an entire town. So take these seriously, bring in the loose things from your yard, park the car under cover if you can, and know where the sturdiest interior room of your home is. It costs you nothing to be ready, and it can save you a great deal. Now let me tie the storms back to the bigger pattern, because they are not separate stories. They are the sound of the pattern changing. Every one of these fronts is a boundary between the old air mass and the new one, between the summer that is fighting to hang on and the cooler regime that is trying to take over. As the block matures over the next week, an upper ridge is forecast to expand from the Four Corners region into the southern plains, while the flow aloft over the northern plains bends and shifts east across the Midwest and into the northeast. That is the signature of the whole thing coming together. The storms this week are the friction of that transition. Once the block fully locks in and the big cool anomaly settles down over the northern and eastern states around the end of the month, the atmosphere calms in those regions because the sharp temperature contrast that fuels the storms moves south with the front. Let me talk about the tropics for a moment, because you may have heard chatter about a system out in the Atlantic, and I want to give you the honest, grounded read rather than the scary one. There's the possibility of a tropical wave rolling off and trying to develop out in the Atlantic, but the odds of it becoming something significant that threatens land are low right now, and here is the fascinating part. The very same pattern we have been talking about is part of the reason. Remember that strengthening El Niño? One of the things a strong El Niño does is crank up the wind shear across the Atlantic. Wind shear is when winds blow at different speeds and directions at different heights, and it is absolutely brutal for a young tropical system. It rips the storm apart before it can organize, tilting and shredding the tall thunderstorms that a hurricane needs to survive. On top of that, if the block sends a cold front pushing far enough out, it can inject dry, stable air and even more shear right into the path of any wave trying to spin up, effectively pushing it away and keeping it weak. So while the tropics are never something to completely ignore during the season, the atmospheric deck is currently stacked against major development, and that is a direct consequence of the same forces reshaping your local forecast. Here's a good moment for the second thing I want you to weigh in on down in the comments. This one is about trust. When two of the world's best forecast models disagree the way the American and European models are disagreeing right now, which one do you find yourself believing and why? Some of you follow this stuff closely and have your own read on which model has been performing better lately. Others just want to know the bottom line. Tell me how you personally handle a forecast when the experts themselves are split, because that tension between certainty and honesty is at the heart of what makes forecasting so hard and so interesting. Let me get concrete about the temperatures you can actually expect, because this is what most of you came for. In the immediate term, highs across the central and northern parts of the country settle into the 70s and 80s, which for many of you is a welcome step down. But push into the central and southern states, and you are still looking at readings over 100, with the southeast in the high 90s to around 100, and the desert southwest still cooking past 110 to 115. And remember, those are the raw air temperatures. The heat index, the feels like number, runs higher once humidity is factored in, which is exactly why the Climate Prediction Center is warning about extreme heat as a real hazard and not just a discomfort. As the days tick by, each cold front that swings through knocks the northern temperatures down a notch, but the heat keeps trying to rebuild right behind it. So it becomes a rhythm. Cool, then warm, until the big block finally slams the door. That big moment, the deepest cool shot, is the payoff of this entire forecast, and it lands as we cross from next Tuesday and Wednesday into the final days of the month. That is when the coolest air arrives, deeper and colder than the appetizers we get this week, with the Midwest, Great Lakes, and Northeast potentially running 10 to 20 degrees below average, overnight lows sliding into the 50s, and in the coldest scenarios, the 40s in a few spots. When forecasters compare the shorter range models against the long-range climate model, there is agreement that cooler air is coming, though the long-range guidance is a touch less aggressive about how deep it dives. That is the same American versus European tension showing up again in a different form. The trend, though, the direction everything is leaning, favors the colder outcome for the northern tier, and possibly a push of that cooler air farther south than we have seen in a long time if the stronger block verifies. So who ends up where when the dust settles? A large chunk of the northern and central country lands comfortably in the 50s and 60s for overnight lows and pleasant days that finally feel like the turn of the season. The zone that had been stuck in the 90s drops into the 70s. The zone that had been baking in the hundreds may ease into the 80s. But the far south and the desert southwest, sitting under that ridge, stay hot, and if any relief reaches them at all, it comes late and it comes modest. Then, as we move into the first third of September, the guidance hints that the cold front pushes even deeper, which would extend and expand the relief. That is the optimistic branch of the forecast, and I will be watching it closely because if it holds, it means a genuine lasting break for a much larger share of the country. Let me step back now and put all of this together into one clear picture, because I promised you at the start that you would understand this better than the headlines, and here is the whole thing in a single breath. A rare double block is forming, one dome of high pressure anchoring near Alaska and another near Greenland, forced into place partly by a rapidly strengthening El Niño out in the Pacific. That double block buckles the jet stream, carving a deep trough down the middle of the country that floods the north and east with unusually cool air for late August, while simultaneously building a heat ridge that traps dangerous, drought-feeding heat over the south and the desert southwest. The clash between the incoming cool air and the lingering summer warmth fires off rounds of storms, mostly wind and hail-driven rather than tornadic, as the pattern rearranges itself. And the single biggest question left hanging is how far south that cold front ultimately pushes. A question the American and European models are actively arguing over right now, with the deeper, more dramatic solution favored by the American model and the more restrained one held by the European. The reason I am confident telling you the relief is coming is that the driving signals, the negative North Atlantic Oscillation, the negative East Pacific Oscillation, and the strengthening El Niño are all pointing the same direction at the same time, and that kind of agreement is what gives a forecast its backbone. The reason I am not going to pretend I know the exact temperature in your backyard on the last day of the month is that the depth of the block is still being sorted out, and it is weather, which means it will wobble and shift a little between now and then. What I can promise is that I will keep tracking every new run of the models, every update to those key signals, and I will tell you the truth as it evolves. whether that truth is the cold plunging farther than we hoped or the block backing off sooner than we wanted. If you have made it this far, you now understand a pattern that is about to define the next 2 weeks of weather for tens of millions of people, and you understand it not as a headline but as a machine. Gears turning from the Pacific Ocean to the top of Greenland to the front porch outside your door. That is the whole point of this channel. Not to scare you, not to hype you, but to hand you the real picture so you can plan your life, protect your family, and actually know what is coming and why. The heat that has felt like it would never end is finally meeting its match, and the door to autumn is cracking open earlier than expected across a big piece of this country. So here is what I am asking. If this made the forecast clearer for you, hit that like button because it genuinely helps more people find honest weather coverage instead of clickbait. Share this with someone you know who has been miserable in the heat because relief is on the way and they deserve to hear it. And if you're not already part of the family, subscribe to F for Forecast right now and turn on notifications because this pattern is moving fast, the models are updating constantly, and I will be here breaking down every twist the moment it happens. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you are ready for the cool down or dreading it, and I will see you in the next one. Stay safe, keep an eye on the sky when those storms roll through, and remember, the atmosphere just made its move and now you know exactly what it means.